The turn of the 20th century was a different time, a different era. It was a world in which mathematicians and philosophers could be global celebrities, a world that they worked to change, and a world in which their work changed them. Today's guest is Jason Socrates Bardi, author of the new book, The Great Math War: How Three Brilliant Minds Fought for the Foundations of Mathematics. We're going to talk today about the true story of three geniuses and find out what happens when people stop being polite and start getting real. I'm Jason Herbert, and this is A Reckoning. My name is Jason Herbert. I'm a Southerner who lives in the West. I'm a historian, an outdoorsman, and a movie buff. I like finding new answers to old questions, and this is A Reckoning. Jason, how the hell are you, man? An outstanding choice, by the way. I was reading the preface of the book about your parents' dilemma in the choice of your name, and I think that they settled on the proper, the obvious choice.
Yeah. No, I thought that was a funny story. I had heard that from the time I was a little kid, the story of my middle name, but I had no idea when I started writing this book. I was maybe 6 months into the research, and I was talking to my dad one day, and started telling him about what it was about, and I mentioned Bertrand Russell, and he was like, oh yeah, we almost named you Bertrand Russell. Because he was at that time a very famous philosopher. My dad was a philosophy graduate student.
Mm-hmm.
Russell actually died a few days after I was born. And it was, but he was a very different Russell. And so I was blown away by that. My dad was blown away when I told him about how very different Russell of 1900 was from Russell of 1969, where he was, protesting the Vietnam War, and he was, protesting nukes. He was a big protester, getting arrested, refusing to comply. Yeah, and he said outrageous things, of course, and he was known for that.
This was actually okay. So here's an interesting thing. I start picking up the book, and I'm like, Bertrand Russell. This is the second book I've had on this podcast with this cat. I'm like, I never heard. A friend of mine wrote a book on Henri Bergstrom, and like he was in that significantly, and so I'm getting a different taste of him in this book. I'm like, what is it with this guy? He keeps coming back around to me in these books. I was like, I don't know. He didn't come off well in the first book that I read to him. So I was like, all right, who is this guy this time?
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to see him in a different light. And I have to tell you, sir, you did this crazy thing with this book, and we'll get into it. But like, I went into history so I could avoid math, and now here I'm like, oh man. And so I'm reading this history about these guys, and I'm like, this is so beyond me. Let's just jump into this, Jason. You want to, before we jump into this book and these three dudes, I think "dude" is the correct term for academics in this context. You want to tell us about yourself?
It's the modern term.
Yeah. Okay. Good. I don't know where it would have been, say, in 1914. Gentleman. I don't know. Dude is like the word now. So, you want to introduce yourself and tell us like your work?
Yeah, sure. So this is the third book I've written, and I have written a few books on the history of math, but they're unusual because even though I have an undergraduate degree in math, I'm not a mathematician. I'm not, an academic who studies these things. I haven't studied math in decades, except in the course of this. And actually, I should admit, I study a lot of math when I write these books. In fact, for this one, I had to teach myself set theory, which was something that I had never somehow studied when I was an undergraduate. But anyway, I write books about math. I'm also a science journalist, a health journalist. I write mainly, that's the funny thing in my day job. I write mostly about biology, cancer, neuroscience. I write, I for a long time, I've written about infectious diseases. And I'm always trying to find a way to put those things into the book. It's not, ultimately, those are usually some of the first things that get cut. And this is, an example here. I did a lot of research on the 1918 flu, which was a very significant event that took place during this book. I mean, the book covers a period from sort of the 1880s through 1938. But in the end, I didn't say anything about 1918 flu, because at the end of the day, you sort of focus on the narrative as it unfolds. But I think there's something behind your question, which is or behind what you said, which is about mathematics and history. And I have faced this problem of telling people I'm writing a book, and they become very interested, and then I say, well, it's a book about mathematics. And I mean, that's like throwing a hand grenade into the room. They're running. I mean, literally, I was at a party a few months ago, and and this guy came up to me. He was asking me, I heard you just finished a book. It's coming out. And I told him, yeah. And he asked me what it was about. And I said it was mathematics. And, he pulls out his dead cell phone. Oh, I have to take this, and runs away. And that's the kind of thing. But this is what I say to those people. I mean, so you could say that about anything, right? I'm not a mathematician, so why should I read about mathematics? But what I always say to people who question that, why is this interesting? I say, look at mountain climbing. How many of us have read books about mountain climbing? We've all read the, Into Thin Air, right? Or we've seen the movie. Man. We love that stuff.
Absolutely.
There's something about Mount Everest that's completely compelling, and the quest to conquer Everest that's compelling. But most of us are not mountain climbers. Most of us don't, do this for a living. We're never going to set foot in the Himalayas in our entire lives. And yet we find it compelling. Why is it compelling? Because it's a human quest.
Yeah.
It's a human struggle. And that's exactly what this is. There's an intellectual component to this. So it's sort of mind-bendingly philosophical, how does the universe work component, which I think only adds to the allure. And it, added significantly to my workload, because it's very hard to understand, let alone explain. I sometimes say that what I do is I explain things that nobody understands to people who don't even care.
Well, we say the idea is, okay, this is about math, mathematicians, but it's really, it feels more like it's about ego and drive and purpose, and this need really in a lot of ways to, legitimize oneself or to validate one's own work is really what it comes down to. So you talk about this idea of like comparing this to climbing the Himalayas, and I think it's a really good analogy, because it's ultimately about like this conquering, right? This quest to say, I did this. I figured it out. I got to this, right? And then you've got these other two guys, and in this case, this fractured friendship that's going on, this really kind of like, what's the word I'm looking for here? It's this really contentious story of guys trying to like put themselves out there. And, It just happens to be in this case of mathematics. So listening right now, don't let this scare you, because I made it through this book and I freaking loved it. So I love this. You start off early in the book. You say, this is a book about lies. What do you mean by that?
Well, it's not so much the lies that we tell other people in daily life, so much as the lies that we tell each other, we tell ourselves. The biggest lie that I talk about in the book is the idea of infinity and how we look at infinity. And for thousands of years, people, philosophers, mathematicians, everyone, scientists, everybody had the wrong idea about infinity. And that was basically Aristotle's fault, because he defined infinity as something that was almost imaginary, potential. It was something that you couldn't actually have. And the irony was, Aristotle and all the ancients, they saw the universe as infinite. And so he contrasted infinity as a mathematical concept, which, was potential in his mind. It was imaginary, with the actual universe, which he saw as actually infinite. And of course, modern science teaches us that it's the exact opposite, that, the universe is not infinite, it's finite. It had a Big Bang birth, and it has a finite edge, and we can define how big the universe is. Infinity, however, is not actually potential. It's not imaginary. It's something that you can manipulate mathematically and talk about. And that's thanks to the work of the first mathematician I talk about in the book, who is George Cantor, who was a German mathematician. And he was the first person to really treat infinity mathematically. And he did it by inventing something called set theory, which it opened up a whole can of worms in mathematics. And that's sort of where the book starts, because it was because of him and his work, especially his work defining different types of infinity. You have big infinity, you have small infinity. And it was because of that crisis emerged in mathematics. So quickly, paradoxes were discovered, and these were things that were seen as foundational flaws, the very heart of mathematics. So it's almost like seeing a crack in the foundation of a building. It's a danger sign, it's a warning sign, and that's what started this whole book.
All right. Well, this is absolutely fascinating to me, and I got to go back because you mentioned that you had to teach yourself set theory. Like during the research of this book, which obviously makes sense, right? When I was writing my dissertation, I learned more about cattle than I ever, ridiculous amounts. I spent a lot of time in the field, literally. But how does one create a theory, Jason? Like you talk about how this guy created this set theory. I'm like, how does one just create a mathematical principle? Like, where does that come out of?
Yeah, he was a strange genius, Cantor, and he was driven by this incredible endurance to come up with new. I mean, he came up with concepts that nobody had ever even thought of, ways of proving things that nobody had ever thought of. So partly it was his own originality, but there's also, he was a strange character because he was very influenced by his father, who was a hard driving businessman who wanted him to go into business, and mathematics was sort of their compromise. His father wrote him a letter that was kind of neither borrower nor beggar be type letter, if you remember that from Hamlet. He carried this letter wherever he went for his entire life on his person. And it was, it warned him about, beware of, hidden enemies and friends who are enemies and that kind of thing. And it was this sort of, it set up this paranoia. Now, people argue about what actually caused Cantor's downfall. So he suffered from terrible mental illness, and he had to be institutionalized over and over and over for most of his late adult life. He, in fact, died in an institution. And he was sort of psychologically crushed by the events in his life. And a lot of people blame his father. I think sometimes they make too much of it. A lot of people blame other mathematicians, and some people loved his ideas, some people absolutely hated them, and set out to argue with him and knock him down. And so he faced these kind of struggles his entire life. But the other thing that really defines him was he was like, I compare him to Elwood Blues from the Blues Brothers, if you remember, who, the famous line, "We're on a mission from God." And that was Cantor in a nutshell. He was convinced that he was getting directives, that he was somehow tapping into the absolute. In fact, his ideas of the infinite, the idea of having two different types of infinity, a really big infinity and a regular infinity, was so tied to his concept of divine. And in fact, he reached out to members of the Catholic Church. There was a pope at the time, ironically named Leo, coincidentally, who, so we now have Leo the 14th. Well, Leo the 13th was the pope in the late 1800s. And Cantor tried reaching out to some of his cardinals and selling them on the idea of infinity and the absolute infinity. and having two infinities, one which was accessible to humans, one which was reserved for God himself. But he really, really thought he had sort of tapping into some sort of divine truth. And that kept him going more than anything else, even as he faced all of his mental health crises.
Okay, so this is what becomes fascinating to me on a couple of different levels, especially as we get into our three combatants. I guess we'll call this in the book. But it feels to me, Jason, like all of these guys, including Cantor, are like motivated by this desire above like solving equations, above like math, like this higher thing. And I remember I was talking to my friend Kelsey Johnson, who wrote this amazing book on astrophysics, and it felt like ultimately what they were really trying to do was use these equations to almost get down to this idea of this human condition. Like talk about these ideas of the infinity, and then that leads into how did we get here? What are we doing here? What's the point of all this? And kind of coming down to like this equation for that. Do you find that in not just maybe this book here, but also in your other work, does science and math, does religion and math and science, do they get along, or what's the relationship between the guys we're talking about, say, in this book, Christianity, higher power? Are these divine believers?
Yeah, I mean, I think historically, certainly, the two were more intertwined than they are today. The division started, probably during the scientific Reformation, and certainly today, I think it's the rare person who even tries to reconcile the two. I mean, famously, the guy, remind me, what is his name? The former director of the NIH. Collins. So Francis Collins, who used to be the director of the NIH, he wrote a book about reconciling his faith with his approach to science. And I think in many ways the two are not incompatible. But that's a real specific way of saying it. I mean, that sort of reflects where we are today. Not incompatible. Whereas, I think for somebody like Cantor, he believed that the two were hand in hand. And so, and I mean, I think that there are a lot of other things that you could say about it. I mean, the big elephant in the room, of course, is the Catholic Church, because the most famous example of all of, the conflict between religion and science is the prosecution of Galileo and the, refusal to admit that he was right about, and actually, I think just recently, in the last 5 years, the Catholic Church admitted Galileo was right. But let me answer the question from another perspective, which is the question of infinity. And so when you start talking about infinity, and especially when you start talking about large infinities, which admit more numbers than you can actually even enumerate if you had infinite time, then the conceptually, and I'm going off of mathematics now and just talking from a purely philosophical conceptual point of view. Conceptually, you can think about possibilities that exist that would include all possibilities. And so is it possible that that the two are compatible? Of course it is.
All right, well, I want to ask you about our trio here in this book. My friend Megan Roberts approached me about this book. She sent it to me over from Basic. I love her to death. I was like, war? Yes. All right, good. Math? All right, let's do it. Let's go. Do you want to introduce maybe the stars of our conversation, the stars of the show, kind of do a brief talk about who these guys are? Then we'll kind of dig into like this beef. I don't want to spoil the book for anybody, but I do want to kind of introduce them. Like, this is why we should know these three cats.
Right. Yeah, no, they're three very interesting people. So Bertrand Russell is really the first. I mean, so he's famous, as I said, when he died in 1970, he was known as a philosopher, known as a writer. He popularized philosophy in the 20th century. In fact, he won the Nobel Prize in literature in 1950 for his writings. And he was prolific. You can't even believe the number of articles and books. He was practically writing a book a year over the period that I was writing about him. The only exception to that was when he wrote what's considered, a groundbreaking work in mathematics, a book known as the Principia Mathematica, which you can still buy today. I mean, that's how influential this book was. It was largely, it was one of these books that everybody talked about, but nobody read. But everybody talked about it, and it sort of, made him famous. And it was way more. It was so complicated when he wrote it, and he, I should say that he collaborated with Alfred North Whitehead, who's another famous philosopher. They wrote it together, and when they initially wrote this book, they actually had to pay the publishers to publish it. It wasn't self-published. It was Cambridge University Press that published it. But the university press said, this is too risky. Nobody's going to buy. Who's going to buy this book? And so they forced them to basically pony up half the money for the first print run. But the book was successful. It sold out, and then they reprinted and reprinted again and reprinted again. They came out with a second edition, a third edition. You can still get it today. When I started researching this book, I ordered it off of Amazon, and it arrived within hours. I mean, it's crazy how successful this book was for something as complicated as it was. It was basically the fundamental ideas behind mathematics. What is a number? 1 + 1 = 2, that kind of thing. There's a great comic or graphic novel called Logicomics, which covers Bertrand Russell, and it covers this story. And they make light of the fact that it's this egghead book, this tome, 3 volumes, and you don't even get to 1 + 1 = 2 until page 100 or something like that. Incredibly complicated. But that was Bertrand Russell. The other thing to say about Bertrand Russell is that he was part of the British aristocracy. He was somebody who, he wasn't just born with a silver spoon in his mouth. They owned all the spoons, right? So his grandfather was John Russell, a famous politician. He was the last Whig prime minister in England. He was prime minister, I think, a couple times, but kind of in the 1830s era, and known for passage of, he steered through progressive legislation, on education, on rights, on voting, that kind of thing. And so Russell, his family was struck by a terrible tragedy when he was a very young child. He was 4 years old when his sister and his mother died. And then his father later died about a year later. And so he and his remaining brother were left in the care of his grandmother, Lady Russell, and she was a very strict disciplinarian. She didn't trust public schools, so she had him homeschooled. He was sort of alone in this big manor by himself, learning. And then eventually when he went off to school, he sort of, rejected a lot of those early things. But one thing he didn't reject was his aristocratic upbringing. So he saw Great Britain as a young man. He thought, rah-rah empire, the colonies need a strong Britain. And so that's sort of the Russell of 1900, but it's a changing person. He changed his views, and it was largely because of the Boer War, and the horrors of the Boer War. And so a lot of people think that the Nazis invented concentration camps, but in fact they were an invention long before they ever showed up in Germany and Poland. And the British actually ran the first concentration camps in the 20th century. They were, they're also largely seen as a Spanish invention because the Spanish had concentration camps in Cuba prior to the Spanish-American War. Spain had been fighting a war with Cuba and Cuban rebels for many decades by that point. But news of these concentration camps, and not just the concentration camps, but the sort of British conduct of the war, and they had a land clearance policy, which was something they hadn't invented, but had been going on in wars. I don't have to tell you, you're a historian. Anyone who is suspected of harboring the Boer commandos, they would burn the farm, they would kill the farm animals, and that's really what what led to the concentration camps is that burning people's farms, burning people's homes creates a refugee crisis. Where do you put those people? So they sought to put them in, officially they were called camps of refuge. We know them now as concentration camps. And so that kind of changed Russell's view of things, and he became very political later in life as a result. Let me not linger any longer on Russell. I want to talk a little bit about David Hilbert. So David Hilbert is somebody he was a German mathematician. He was the most famous mathematician of his day, arguably the best, although some people would say Henri Poincaré in France was a better mathematician, 6 of one, half dozen the other. Hilbert was definitely famous, and he was so famous that in the early 90s, they actually put his head on a stamp in Germany. I mean, that's how famous he was. And one of the things he was famous for was a lecture that he gave in 1900 that is, people still talk about this lecture today, where he laid out 23 problems that need to be solved. And, it's sort of hard to conceive of how revolutionary this was today, because nowadays people do this kind of state of the discipline talk all the time. I mean, you see these in all kinds of fields, and if somebody gets some big award, if they win the Nobel Prize or whatever, the first thing they do is talk about, what are the problems that need to be solved. But that wasn't really a thing when Hilbert was growing up. People would talk about work that they were doing or work that they had done, not things that hadn't been done, not things that they didn't even intend to work on. And that's exactly what Hilbert did. And it wasn't just that he said these are problems that we should solve. It was a very impractical way of looking at the world, because he chose hard problems, impossible problems. Some of them had been around for centuries and had never been solved. Let me say one other thing about him, which is that he grew up in a town called Königsberg, which is now a part of Russia. It's Kaliningrad. It's been since renamed, but it was sort of semi-famous in his day as a mathematical, location, because there was a famous math problem that had been around for many, many centuries called the Seven Bridges problem, because his city had a river that ran through it, and the river split. And before the split, there was an island, and there were 7 bridges. So there were a couple bridges, 2 on each side of the island. There was one connecting the island to the mainland, and then one other bridge downstream on each side of where the river split. And so the question was, is it possible to cross every bridge only once and make sure you cross them all without getting your feet wet? Obviously, you can cross one, swim to the other side, whatever. And the answer was no, you can't do it. It's impossible. But how do you prove that? And this idea, this problem had been around for many, many years. And more than 100 years before Hilbert was born, another famous mathematician, Leonhard Euler, had solved this problem. But he didn't just solve it. He solved it by inventing new ideas in mathematics. And that was, so growing up in that city, I sort of think of it as, what if you were a musician, a guitarist, and you grew up in Liverpool in the 70s? You would see the Beatles everywhere. Everything you see reflects the Beatles, because that's who you are, that's what you love. And that's what it was like for Hilbert. So he sort of grew up kind of bathed in this idea of mathematics, but not just the idea of mathematics, but the idea that you can solve things by inventing new types of math. And that was really what defined him throughout his career. And he was a hard driving mathematician. He was very successful. And he still, somewhere in my book, I list all the different things he attached his name to: Hilbert transforms, Hilbert groups, all these kind of math concepts that he came up with throughout his life. And, and he was indisputably later in the book, in the 1920s, he was indisputably the greatest mathematician alive. And, up there with Einstein. Einstein was, a physicist, obviously. But this is somebody, Hilbert took on Einstein. He challenged Einstein he didn't challenge him exactly, but they were both racing for the same thing in 1915, which was the equations for general relativity. And he almost beat Einstein. He was 2 weeks short. Einstein published his work and just 2 weeks before Hilbert did. And so, that says something about, the size of his genius, of his intellect. And then finally, the last person I wanted to mention is Brouwer, and he's a Dutch mathematician, very interesting person, very unusual. And so I invite your listeners to read the book. He was a fascinating mix of just seemingly at odds characteristics. He was a mathematician. He was also a genius. I mean, he, I think, still holds the record today in Holland for the youngest person ever to graduate from high school at the age of 12 or something like. He was also enamored by strange religious and spiritual ideas. He was also a health nut, so he lived in part of, the outskirts of Amsterdam in areas that were dominated by what we might think of today as communes, kind of hippie refuges. He had his own, kind of country refuge, and if you search for pictures of him, you'll find a lot of pictures of him with no shirt because he was into nude sunbathing. This is like, we're talking turn of the century stuff, 125 years ago. He was also a strict vegetarian. He was a vegan. He was really into health. He would spend hours and hours outside in the sun, sunbathing. He had a very strict and frugal diet. He was also a little bit of a madman. He could be alarmingly angry and just upset about things and pursue things to the nth degree. I've read, if you read his biographies, you'll see that he was involved in court cases that went on for years and years and years, where he was a plaintiff, but he amassed boxes and boxes of documents and, went after the people he perceived as his enemies, with a ruthlessness that was unbelievable. He also was a brilliant mathematician, and so he's most famous for topology, and he created some of the most groundbreaking, influential ideas in topology, which is a completely different field. I don't really talk about it that much in the book, except to define it. Suffice it to say that one thing he did was he was the first person in history to have an article appear in print with a color plate, where they actually did color printing for his article because, the color was essential for depicting what he was depicting. And this was the first time. I mean, it must have been incredibly expensive to do that, but that was sort of his prominence, his importance. So now the stage is set. You have these three different people, and they were kind of on a collision course. And getting back to the analogy of Mount Everest, it was almost as if they each had their different approaches. So one person says, we have to approach on the south face, the Hillary step. One person says, no, the north face, go straight up the rock, that sort of thing. And so they had their different approaches to solving this fundamental problem that was perceived to exist at the very heart of mathematics.
Yeah, you want to talk a little bit about maybe this central problem, and then also maybe their relationships, because there's a falling out here that happens between a couple of these guys here as well, yeah?
Oh, absolutely. No, I mean, Brouwer was younger. He was the youngest of the three, and he was younger than Hilbert by a generation. But he regarded Hilbert as kind of his hero. I wouldn't say mentor, because he never worked for him. They never worked together in the same university, but he loved Hilbert, and they vacationed together when he was a young man. And he was so proud of the fact that, he had this conversation with Hilbert. He was at that time, sort of a 20-something, just out of graduate school, just, like almost what we would consider today a postdoc. And he met with Hilbert, who was, already famous, world famous. His face had already been on a stamp. And Hilbert listened to his ideas. He was enthusiastic about his ideas. He basically helped him get an editorship at the journal that Hilbert ran, which is going to come up later because later they get into a fight and Hilbert has him thrown out of that chair. But in the years before World War I, they're the best of friends and thinks the world of Hilbert. Now, Russell is a little bit different. He's in Britain. Britain is still at the very end of its what mathematicians and historians call its splendid isolation period, where especially in mathematics, the British mathematicians are kind of, a world unto themselves. And Russell was part of the generation that kind of broke that. And he broke it particularly in mathematical philosophy, and he discovered the writings of German mathematicians, and that was really what started him down his path. But Russell was a strange case because he was working on doing something. He wanted to basically establish the logical foundations of mathematics. So he thought math is based on logic and it's simply a matter of defining things. And it was a problem almost of his own creation because Russell had discovered something in the early 1900s that we now call Russell's paradox. There's another mathematician, a German mathematician named Ernst Zermelo, who some people insist it should be the Russell-Zermelo paradox because Zermelo discovered it independently. And I do apologize to Ernst Zermelo several times in my book, but I call it Russell's paradox because that's what people call it. So this was the flaw, basically, at the heart of mathematics. And what is a paradox? A paradox is not an ambiguity. It's not an uncertainty. It's, something where it could be this or it could be that. What a paradox is much more fundamentally disturbing. A paradox says that something is and it isn't at the same time. And so, the most classic form of this is what's known as the liar's paradox. And it goes back to a famous ancient philosopher from the island of Crete named Epimenides. And Epimenides said, and this is actually, he's quoted in the Bible, this quote, but Epimenides said, all Cretans are liars, and he himself is a Cretan. He's from Crete. And so the idea of the liar's paradox is the statement, this statement is false. So it is if it isn't, and it isn't if it is. And that's a paradox. So one thing being two things that are completely diametrically opposed at the same time. This is true and this is false. And that was what Russell discovered at the very heart of mathematics. And that's what set him on his 10-year journey to try to solve this problem with Alfred North Whitehead by writing this book, Principia Mathematica, and, pursuing what's now known as the field of logicism, where you're looking for the logical foundations of mathematics. And he failed. He wrote a very successful book. It, sold many copies. It established his bona fides, out the wazoo. Harvard was recruiting him. Everybody was recruiting him. He became a very famous philosopher and, mathematical philosopher in the years before World War I. But he sort of burned out at the same time. And so for most of the second half of the book, where the real battle takes place between Brouwer and Hilbert, and they're both fighting over their approaches to solving the foundations of math, Russell is kind of out of the story. He gets involved in politics. Before that, he has an affair. It sort of changes his life. He falls in love. He starts writing fiction. He starts writing other things. He gets really involved in politics. World War I kind of changes everything for him because he becomes a peace activist. In fact, he's imprisoned at the end of World War I for sedition, for acts unbecoming. He wrote a pamphlet that was seen as antithetical to the British war effort in 1917. He was prosecuted and he was imprisoned in Brixton Prison for 6 months. In fact, he got out just days before the armistice, and he never really returned to mathematics after that. I mean, he kind of, he got involved in other things. He got married. He started having kids. His life went on. He was a famous writer at that point, and so he continued down that path. And so he sort of took himself out of the story. But let's get back to it. So I'm sorry, what was the original question?
Well, one of the things that I'm interested in here is really, you've got some real big touchstone moments here in the early 20th centuries. We're moving on here. And I keep thinking, Jason, that about the radical difference between, say, late 19th, early 20th century and, say, our age, which is like when mathematicians and philosophers could be celebrities. Right. We talk about Russell and like people knew him. We talk about, we talk about this Paris conference and, and it's like, this is a big deal. These things are getting reported on. These people are important, not only in their own fields, but in the country and globally. What I'm kind of wondering, it's World War I comes along. And here's our chance to really kind of talk about Spanish flu as well, right? Which is like, you have these two massive, devastating effects on the world scale. And I'm kind of wondering, and these three gentlemen are part of the story. Maybe we could even talk about just mathematics in general. What happens to mathematics as a result of World War I and the Spanish flu? Is there a transformation in the ways people start thinking about math? Is there a new need to create new devastating killing machines via math? How does this conflict affect it?
I mean, I think that certainly the idea of patriotism was very different, in the early 90s than it was after World War I, and a lot of people were true believers in the cause, and so there are many examples of not just famous mathematicians and scientists, physicists who went to war and threw themselves into the war effort. Nernst is the greatest example, the chemist, and he basically invented chemical warfare in, World War.
Thanks. Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Awesome.
But there are plenty of other examples of people who were working on things. Richard Courant, who's famous for the Courant Mathematical Institute at NYU, is named after him. He became an American mathematician during the prior to and during World War II. But during World War I, he worked for the German military and he served on the front lines. He was wounded. While he was recovering, he came up with scientific ideas for how to, communicate wirelessly, sort of trying to solve some of the problems. Mathematicians the same way. Wittgenstein, who is known as a philosopher, but he was an engineer, he was a mathematician. He actually enlisted in the Austrian army and fought on the front lines in World War I and almost died himself. And, he was another example of somebody who he could have easily sat out the war. He was extremely rich. His wealth made Bertrand Russell's look like nothing, so there are these kind of stories, but the greater effect of World War I was that it sort of put everything on hold. There were still things going on. I mean, I talked a little bit earlier about this famous battle between Hilbert and Einstein to work out the equations of general relativity. All that took place while the Battle of Verdun was playing out in the background. And so this is, we call the Battle of Verdun a battle, but really it was a long, multi-month campaign, but it resulted in millions of deaths. I mean, I think there were something like, 700,000 allies killed and an similar number of Germans and Austrians killed in that battle over the course of several months. And while this was playing out, there was still this, this race to find the equations of general relativity. But mathematically and scientifically, all kind of correspondence ended. So it wasn't possible for a British mathematician to be in correspondence with a German mathematician. There were no conferences in these days. Travel was restricted. So the kind of normal things that you think of in the scientific enterprise ceased to exist. And then there are other effects as well. I mean, of course, rationing during the war severely restricted calories and the type of calories that people eat, in Germany, especially where there was a blockade that prevented a lot of food from coming into the country. 1916 was referred to as the turnip winter because of the prevalence of turnips on the dinner plate. That actually may have had the dietary restrictions may have had an impact on David Hilbert, because he later developed a form of anemia called pernicious anemia and almost died from it. In fact, one of the big reasons why he pursued Brouwer was he thought he was on his deathbed. He thought he was about to die because of this disease. And so he said, it's now or never. I've got to take this guy out. So that was one thing. The other thing is that the Russian Revolution was a massive impact. And so that changed a lot of things with this story in particular, because the idea of a revolution, 1918, was suddenly very hot. It seemed very sexy. In Germany and in other countries, people were enamored of this idea of a revolution. They hadn't yet seen what it was going to mean, right? But in 1918, when things were first starting to open up and mathematicians were first starting to talk to each other, Brouwer and his allies began talking about their approach to mathematics as a revolution. There's a famous line by another mathematician who was saying, "Das ist die Revolution," that is the revolution, and sort of casting it in these kind of terms. And so all of these things affected. And of course, you mentioned the Spanish flu. I mean, that affected things as well. A lot of people died. There are, cases of famous mathematicians and scientists who died or who lost loved ones in that pandemic. In the same way that, you think about, the COVID-19 pandemic and how does that define our times? Are you and I ever going to forget what happened? Are we ever going to move past it? No. I mean, that was, I think in terms of my lifetime, 9/11, COVID-19, these are the kind of things
you say
that
during COVID now.
Right, exactly.
Right? It's a time period in our lives.
Exactly. And that was definitely the case with the Spanish flu as well. You asked me over email, are there stories that I didn't tell? And that was one of the big stories. I mean, I did an embarrassing amount of research on COVID-19. On Spanish flu, and barely mentioned any of it. There were a couple other examples. I mean, the Treaty of Locarno, which it turns 100 this year, is largely forgotten as a peace treaty in history, but it was seen as a major thing at the time. I did an embarrassing amount of research on Locarno, thinking I was going to talk about this, and actually, in the end, I just didn't. I didn't have time. I didn't have the space to talk about that. The reason I'm bringing it up is that there is a criticism that is out there of this book and my writing in general, that, why am I talking about World War I? Why am I talking about the Boer War, Great Depression? What do these things have to do with mathematics? And so I often get that criticism, and I feel it. And, one level, there are ways that you can say, well, this historic event shaped these particular events and things like that. But that's not really why I do it. I think of history as often being something where we're focused on one particular story, and we're kind of seeing what can we ignore in order to focus on this story. And I don't want to ignore these things that are happening in the periphery, in the background. And in some cases, you can make the direct connection. In other cases, you can't. And yet it's there. And you know it's there. And you know that the people who you're writing about in history were deeply influenced by these things, by World War I, by Spanish flu, by the Great Depression. Another example is the German Treaty of Versailles economic malaise of the early 1990s, that bankrupted the country, that sent inflation through the roof, where 1 year it was something like 7 or 8 marks to a dollar. The next year it was like 7 trillion marks to a dollar.
Yeah.
You hear these stories about people having wheelbarrows full of cash, or they get paid and the value of their paycheck plummets by the time they're able to cash it, or people paying rent in butter, that kind of thing. I mean, these are the sort of stories that very much affected, what was going on at German universities.
Yeah, I actually really dig how you do that, because I think it also helps to humanize these people and realize like these things are affecting how these guys are looking at the world around them and the importance of their own work. We talk about this beef we're going to talk about coming up between Hilbert and Brouwer. But before we get there, I have to ask you a question, Jason.
Sure.
Where are the Americans? Are we not mathing well? Like, are we not counting yet? Like, what's happening?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. So the answer is not quite, not yet. And there were certainly some notable examples in the 19th century of great American mathematicians, and in the early 20th century, and there were the philosophy department at Harvard was trying to build a strong mathematical philosophy footprint. There were some great departments, and we were ahead of the game in terms of educating women in mathematics and having PhD programs. But it really what transformed American mathematics, and indeed a lot of disciplines in the United States, was something known as the Great Migration, which I talk about at the end of the book, where when the Nazis came into power in 1933, one of the first things they did was take an iron fist to the universities, and that caused a lot of university professors to leave. Certainly, they overtly targeted any professor who was Jewish, but that didn't just mean the Jewish professors. A lot of professors who were not Jewish left in protest, or they had Jewish loved ones or wives, and so they migrated, and it wasn't just the United States. People left for Germany. People left for Great Britain. They left for Russia. They left for other countries in Europe. But the United States had a tremendous advantage in recruiting a lot of these people who were fleeing Germany, because we had the Rockefeller Foundation, and the Rockefeller Foundation had been for years supporting science in Germany. In fact, they built 2 brand new buildings at David Hilbert's university before he retired. And when this started happening, when the Nazis took power, they right away saw, there's an opportunity here. It's a very American story. There's something disastrous happening. How can we turn this to our advantage? And they did. And so they created these funds. They created a program for displaced scholars. They basically started recruiting people, started bringing them in. They were helped by, an accidental detail in there was immigration reform passed in 1924 that largely restricted immigration to the United States, putting limits on the number of people who could immigrate from different countries. This was during the so-called Red Scare, so people were worried about people immigrating from Europe who had communist leanings, and they were going to come and spread their ideas here, and so the 1924 law put restrictions, but there was one notable exception, which was that if you were an academic and you had a job here, you could come. You didn't have to wait in line. You didn't have to fall under the quota system. And there was a pathway to citizenship that was simply by having a faculty position. And so that's what the Rockefeller Foundation did. They created all these different partnerships with different universities to bring people over. And somewhere in my book, I have a list of, some of the famous, it wasn't just mathematicians, it was sociologists, it was economists, it was obviously physicists. The whole Manhattan Project was basically spearheaded by a lot of these European mathematicians and physicists who came over, chemists as well. So hundreds and hundreds of them. So the real answer to your question is, I think American mathematics would eventually dominate, but not until after the period that I'm talking about.
All right. I want to get back to this rivalry. This book kind of becomes the story of these two dudes,
right,
going back and forth. And again, not to give away the entire book, but I do want to give our listeners. I want to give them some juice here. Like let's talk about some beef and what spilling tea. Is that what we're gonna do between Hilbert and Brower? Like, why can't these guys get along? Because you got one guy who's absolutely idolizing the other guy, and then the other guy's like, I'm gonna die. I'm gonna go pick a fight. I mean, this. I spend a lot of time around academics. I certainly recognize the ego, which is why I'm not at a university. But can we talk about this beef between these two guys and what goes wrong?
Yeah, so they are both, they both have huge egos, but not necessarily in a bad way. They're not the type of selfish, egotistical person who is going to punish their competition just for the sake of punishing them or just to assert their own dominance. This is a case where they both very much feel that they are right, and they both think that their own individual approach is the right approach. And to the extent that those approaches are at odds with one another, that's where the problem comes from. And for Hilbert, it's this is a real emergency, because what Brower is doing is he's suggesting a whole new way of thinking about mathematics and mathematical proof that's basically a reset. He wants to hit the reset button and start over, which means throwing out the baby with the bathwater largely. And so he wants to say, we will only accept proof if it's done in this constructivist way, not if you have indirect proofs and other things that Hilbert himself has spent his career championing. He's pursued these things, and so he sees it as a direct threat. Brower doesn't really see Hilbert so much as a direct threat, but he is also, he's a rabble rouser. He's a troublemaker. He's, this is who he is. He just has, he has a devilish streak in him when it comes to pushing other people's buttons. And, it's like that old saying, am I standing on your toe? No, you're stomping on my foot. And that sort of describes Brower in a nutshell. So Brower does himself no favors by, the way in which he dismisses Hilbert. He, talks about Hilbert, part of the old guard, his new revolutionary ideas are going to take over. And initially people are very excited about it, but then it turns out that his approach to mathematics is very, very complicated. It's very long and it's very slow. He's able to show some mathematical proofs, and they take, let's say, 13 pages, where the same approach that Hilbert might take can be done in a couple lines, right? And so it's, Hilbert loves this kind of elegance in mathematics, this, very tight and beautiful mathematics. And so that's kind of the start of their dispute. And the problem is that they never really work it out, because they don't get together very often in the 90s when this dispute is playing out, partly because Germany is racked by terrible economic problems in the early 90s. Right after World War I, Hilbert tries to recruit Brower to his own university in Germany. He sees them as, a valued friend and colleague still in those days. But Brower says no, because he senses that Germany is undergoing severe economic malaise, and he's not wrong about that. He's absolutely right. And so he stays in Amsterdam. Had they come together, things would have been very differently. And I think that the same is true in the mid-1920s. They could have worked things out very amicably, but that's when Hilbert gets sick. He develops pernicious anemia, and it was a death sentence in those days. He should have died, except that two professors at Harvard worked out basically a cure for this disease, where they discovered that eating copious amounts of liver can actually provide, it's a vitamin deficiency, and the liver will give you the vitamin that you need. And so, people started, liver became very, very popular in the mid-1920s because people saw this as a general cure-all. And then eventually these guys, worked out a way to make liver pills. But they both won the Nobel Prize for this later, by the way. But the first thing that they did was they saved Hilbert's life. He was seen as such an important mathematician that they were having these liver pills shipped over from Cambridge, Massachusetts to Germany, specifically for David Hilbert. But that kind of took him out of the game. I mean, he wasn't able to go to conferences. When he did appear someplace, people would be sort of shocked at seeing him because he was like real ill looking. And, everybody was convinced he was going to die. And so that set the stage essentially for this famous, argument that took place in 1928, where Hilbert had Brouwer thrown off of the editorial board of the journal that they both sat on with Albert Einstein, by the way. And so I have a whole chapter devoted to that. It's a crazy power play on Hilbert's part, because it turned out that he couldn't just fire him, because even though he was unpaid, there was it was because he was paid. So because he was paid, he was considered an employee under German employment laws. He couldn't be fired. So what Hilbert did instead was he took the nuclear option. He dissolved the entire board, just erased it, and then reconstituted it, bringing people back one at a time, but not Brouwer. And this had a devastating effect on poor Brouwer. He never saw this coming. He fought against it. He lost. He was thrown off of his own editorial board. This was the most prestigious journal in mathematics in the world, and he oversaw the section on topology. He was the most prestigious topologist in the world, and he was absolutely stunned by this. And he was also having personal problems. He was a pharmacist in his spare time. He owned a pharmacy with his wife. His wife was actually the pharmacist, but he owned the building with her. The city of Amsterdam executed eminent domain and took his building. He fought them in court. He lost again. That happened. That was playing out in parallel to this mathematical fight. So, having two losses like that handed to you at once. And then a third loss came, and this was more of a conceptual one. So he had a notebook in which he wrote down all of his mathematical ideas, both, sane and crazy, and had been doing so for years. And it was in his briefcase, and he was in Belgium waiting, for a train on the platform, and a thief came by, a pickpocket, and stole his briefcase. And he lost it. And he searched and searched. He even consulted psychics to try to, find this precious notebook. He never could. And these things sort of crushed him. And he continued on in mathematics, and he had, a long career after that, but he was never the same. And in fact, I read this really sad thing that late in life, somebody once asked him about mathematics, and he said he doesn't even really like math. There's no joy in it. So it's a tragedy. There are a lot of tragedies in this. And, Hilbert suffers the far greater tragedy, by the way, because Hilbert wins this battle with Brouwer. He gets him thrown off. Brouwer, his ideas, he gets Brouwer's ideas repudiated. And Hilbert seems to be the winner. In 1928, 1929, he's sitting at the very top of his kingdom, and knocked Brouwer away. He thinks then that this is perfect. He's retiring. He reaches retirement age. His university throws him a celebration. They name a street after him. His hometown, going back to Königsberg, he goes there. They have this whole celebration for him. He gives one of the very first radio interviews in history. People are interested in what he has to say. He's the undisputed king of mathematics, and now retiring. And then, ironically, unexpectedly, it all collapses. His whole approach, which is based on this idea that you talked about at the beginning of, we must know, we will know. He was somebody who believed that we could solve any problem, given enough time and energy, that we would. And then along comes a graduate student named Kurt Gödel, who proves through his famous incompleteness theorem that that's not actually true, that there are things which we cannot know, which we cannot prove. And that sort of shatters, Hilbert's worldview. And in fact, this was such a powerful thing that I originally thought about this story as being one of just Hilbert's art, because it has this kind of Shakespearean tragic dimensions where he sees a world, he sets out to build this world, he succeeds and builds this world where any problem under the sun can be solved, and then suddenly everything, the carpet's pulled out from under him, and it falls. He retires after that. A few years after he retires, the Nazis come into power. His university is just completely crushed. All the great professors there leave. They either retire or most of them flee. The Nazis begin to appoint, their commissars into faculty positions there. And so his university is crushed, his ambitions are crushed. And that's the end of the story for Hilbert. But I didn't want it to end there. I mean, I wanted this to be a story of hope, right? And there's a lot more, I'm right now thinking about, my next book, and I really want to pick up from where this one left off in 1938 and kind of, take it on from there, talking about computers and computer science and some of these other things in mathematics. But the hope is this: it's mathematics itself. And one of the things, so in the very 11th hour when I was writing this book, in fact, I think it was after I had already finished the first draft and we had gone through some editing. So I added a couple pages at the very end about neuroscience because I discovered this really rich and interesting, area, subfield in neuroscience that's looking at animal intelligence. And there are a number of studies that have shown animals have the ability to do math, and not just the animals that you would expect, dolphins and apes, but animals like crows, octopi, and also babies. There was a study showing human babies are able to reason and to form competing hypotheses and choose between those hypotheses. They do this by eye tracking and kind of complicated psychological setups like that. But babies as young as 18 months old are able to have two ideas in their head at the same time, and then to see which one is the more likely outcome by looking at where they track their eyes and that sort of thing. So what it suggests to me is that there's something very fundamentally human about mathematics, and not just human, but fundamentally mammalian, animalistic about mathematics. All my life, my adult life, I've had this idea that was drilled into my head by one of my early physics professors, who always used to ask at the beginning of his class, not every individual class session, but at the beginning of a semester, he would ask, why is the world mathematical? And then he would return to this periodically, this question, and he would always inevitably end at the end of the semester by, this kind of, it's still a mystery statement of why is the world mathematical? Well, there are a lot of examples. You look at ferns, you look at shells, you look at space, kind of symmetries that you can see, mathematical stuff that the weather adhering to a mathematical process in the same way that neuronal transmission does, those kind of things. And so he would always ask this question. And, in many ways, this was something that's always in the back of my mind. But I think it's exactly wrong now. I think that given what I was saying about mathematics and the way that all different animals and humans, even babies, have the ability to do math, I think that there's something very fundamental about mathematics, evolutionary, and that we have mathematical abilities because it serves an evolutionary purpose. And not just humans, but other animals have developed these abilities as well, because having the ability to reason, having the ability to form a hypothesis and judge whether this is right, having the ability to count, So Robert Frost talks about, the potato digger in the field counting winter dinners one a hill, each hill being a hill of potatoes. Having the ability to count is a fundamental advantage in terms of evolution because it gives you a sense of, do I have the resources that I need to survive the winter, or do I need to keep gathering and storing these things away? And that's true, of animals as well. Crows can do recursion. I'm not sure why, what evolutionary advantage that serves. Clownfish. There was a great study out of Japan about clownfish, the famous fish from Finding Nemo. They are, despite what happens in that movie with, the great adventure, clownfish are actually fish that stay in the same place their entire lives. They coexist with corals in a specific location, and key to their survival is the ability to recognize friend from foe. And so this group in Japan showed that clownfish actually have the ability to count the number of stripes on another fish so that they can immediately recognize, are they part of my group or not? Because otherwise they look very similar. So there are these kind of evolutionary things in mathematics. And so what I think now, it's not a question of, is the world mathematical? Why is the world mathematical? Of course the world is mathematical, but the real question is, why are we mathematical? And so I think that that's where I wound up with this story in an unexpected way, is this idea of, how do we think about mathematics as a human ability, and how can we really enhance our mathematical abilities? And right now we're in a strange period, and it's been this way my entire life, where mathematics is seen as this really arcane, distant subject. If you're into it, that's great, but if you're not, who is, right? And one of my beliefs is that anyone can do mathematics. In fact, we all do mathematics. And I'm not talking about complicated things. I'm not talking about specific things like quadratic equations, but math ability is something as fundamental to humans as language ability. And nobody ever says, "Oh, I'm not into language. I'm not into reading." I mean, some people aren't, but it's nobody would ever admit that. But people freely say that about mathematics. And in fact, if I could just say one last thing, this idea, this dichotomy between I am a language person, a reading person, or I am a math person, that is a very false dichotomy. And I'll tell you why. One of the best predictors of somebody's ability to do math is their ability with languages. And so if you score really high on a reading test at the elementary level, you probably also score really high on a math test. The two are interlinked, in fact. And the way that we learn math is not purely quantitative, it's also language-based. So that's the other thing I'm interested in.
Jason, that's fascinating. I came to your book knowing very little about these three guys. I knew a little bit about Russell, and I just tore through this thing. If you saw the email, I was copying and pasting from my work email to my personal email. I was sending notes back and forth. So if you're on the Forest Service right now, don't dig around. This is such a cool story. And the story that you shared with me, I just sat here just listening the whole time, man, because I was just engaged with what you're telling me. This is so much fun, dude. The book's out now, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. I was lucky enough to get an early copy of this right here. I love getting the advanced copies of this thing. This is so much fun, dude. Thank you so much for being here. This was a blast, man.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate you taking the time and your interest. And, I think that if I could say one last thing,
please.
I'm a big advocate of looking at some of the untold stories. You actually asked me about this, but we didn't have a chance to talk about it. And there were, of course, I mentioned Locarno was something. Eugenics is another untold story. So, eugenics movement took place in this time, and it's something I didn't really have time for. But I just wanted to, as a historian, and especially somebody you mentioned doing your thesis on cattle. So one of the other untold stories is the invention of barbed wire. Is a fascinating story that it has been told, but it's never really been told well. But how the invention of barbed wire was a revolutionary, transformative invention for the West, because where wood is at a premium, the ability to have these barbed wire fences was massive. And it was really the invention of galvanization and having wire that didn't rust and the ways of winding them. But the fascinating thing about this, it was a massive intellectual property battle in the 1800s. But barbed wire became a technology used in war. And so that story, one of your listeners out there needs to research and write the story of barbed wire, because it's fascinating.
Can I tell you, I have been to the Barbed Wire Museum in La Crosse, Kansas, and it is fascinating.
I read about that. Yeah. I read about that.
Yeah, it's crazy. And of course, now I'm thinking about World War I and that horrible scene from Legends of the Fall where the little brother gets caught up in the barbed wire. And that is going to be stuck in my head for the rest of the day, sir. Yeah. So thank you for that. Jason, I got to get you back. Come back on. We talk about movies on here a lot, man. I'm listening to you talk. I'm like, oh man, I got to hear you. I got to hear your thoughts on stuff too. I got to have you back on this pod, dude. This was way too much fun.
Yeah. I will, so the three things I like the most are movies, food, and mathematics, science, and math. And so those are, I'm game anytime you want to talk movies.
I'm in my head, I'm already thinking Good Will Hunting just right off the bat. So absolutely.
Oh yeah.
Was it? What was it? What was the one with? What was the one with Russell Crowe? Beautiful Mind is the other one I'm thinking about. So.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Lots of egos involved in those films as well. Egos and math. So,
and there's another thing to say, which is cinematography.
Yeah.
And that movie in particular, A Beautiful Mind, changed things, because the scenes where he's writing equations on the glass and they're shooting it through the glass, showing. A lot of times mathematics just becomes artwork in popular depictions, because who understands what those equations are anyway? And, you're writing them out. It's very intricate, very interesting. But that idea of writing on the glass, I have seen that repeated over and over. People have it on their websites. Mathematicians, marketing people at universities have that basic setup, So I think there's a lot in terms of cinematography that you can talk about too. But that was a great book too by Sylvia Nasser, So let's do it again sometime.
Let's do it. Absolutely. But thank you so much for being here, man. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you. I appreciate it. Yep.
And that's a wrap here at Reckoning with Jason Herbert. Thank you so very much to our guest, Jason Socrates Bardi. Thank you so much, Jason, for coming out. Jay's going to be back on this pod a whole lot. He and I spent a lot of time talking after this pod about him coming back. I love this dude. He was so much fun. You can check out his new book. It's called The Great Math War, How Three Brilliant Minds Fought for the Foundations of Mathematics. It is available on on shelves everywhere, bookstores everywhere, through Basic Books. Thank you, of course, to our producer, Fletcher Powell, for making this show run. Thank you, Fletcher, for being here. And thank you all to you for being here, for being part of this crazy thing called Reckoning with Jason Herbert. Thank you. You can check out our Substack at jasonherbert.substack.com. You can find me on social media at Herbert History. Share this pod. Leave us some good reviews. Help us grow this thing. You guys are amazing. You make this thing run. Thanks for being here. We got a whole bunch of stuff coming for you real soon. Ciao for now. Bye.